Our next speaker is Justin Vlasits. He's at the philosophy department here in Tübingen, and he did his PhD in Berkeley on ancient philosophy in 2017. Besides ancient philosophy, his research interests are mainly in logic and in formal epistemology. And unfortunately, Justin will join the University of Illinois this fall, so we are very happy that we have him as a speaker before he leaves. And today his talk is not on ancient philosophy, but on accuracy and the epistemic value of inquiry.
Thanks for the introduction, Alex. Yes, I'm very sad to be leaving. It has been a lot of fun, and it's also been especially fun to start meet all of you as I feel like I'm on my way out the door. I share my screen. So this is, so I initially thought that I would talk about something in ancient philosophy, but then I felt like it was going to be it's too weird for everybody, and so I thought this was something I just started working on recently, and so this seems like a better fit for the group, the interests of the group. So yes, I'm soon to be at Illinois, Chicago. My talk is about accuracy and the epistemic value of inquiry. So the sort of starting thing about this project is that we're not just Homo sapiens, we're Homo quaerens. Inquiry plays a very fundamental role in our lives. If you look at Godin, for example, I think that person is plausibly inquiring. They're not somebody who already has attained wisdom, but the idea behind the bronze is that this somehow represents us as human beings and something fundamental about us. And I think that that's right. The idea that we are people who don't know and that people who want to know. And this is something I'm very interested in generally. So in ancient philosophy, this is something I'm very interested in, and also in the sort of kind of contemporary thinking. And one thing that you would sort of know about this or immediately think is that inquiry does not have merely practical value. So it's not just that we care about inquiring so that we can make money or achieve various non-epistemic ends that we have, but it also has some sort of intrinsically epistemic or cognitive value. And so I'll be talking usually in terms of epistemic value, but I kind of mean something that contrasts with practical. So some people use the term epistemic, other people use the term practical value or cognitive value. My question is, where does this value come from? Why is it that certain inquiries are more valuable than others and things like that? So the plan of the talk is there's two parts. There's the pars destruens. So the accuracy first approach to this topic fails. Then there's the pars construens. Adding in a new value, opinionation, can explain the epistemic value of inquiry. I'll explain what these things are in a second. And conclusions is that accuracy is not the sole epistemic value. And that's I think a kind of interesting result, because a lot of people in the literature are assuming that, and I think this is a pretty good argument that is false. And then opinionation this is the second thing, which is a rather under-discussed epistemic value, deserves more attention. I kind of am not going to go so far as to endorse it, but I think that it has sort of some plausibility and can do some explanatory work. Okay, so the accuracy first approach, I will explain that very briefly. In formal epistemology, the accuracy first approach is the project of reducing all epistemic value to the value of accuracy. So it's a sort of monistic approach. It's saying there's only one really fundamental epistemic value. And then any putative value is justified if and only if it maximizes expected accuracy or minimizes expected inaccuracy, whichever. So the idea is, right, we're trying to hit the bullseye, and that's hence the little image that I made. Okay. So thus far, this approach has been mainly interested in justifying norms on belief or credal states. So people have done work on, for example, should you be a conditionalizer? Should you obey the Kolmogorov axioms? Should you be a ranking theorist? And there are arguments, sort of accuracy arguments on all these things. There's also accuracy arguments about whether you should be logically coherent and not believe contradictions, whether you should have logically closed belief sets, things like that. So both kind of full belief and partial belief. But it's always been about belief states. But inquiry is not a state, it's an action. So you need a sort of a slightly different framework in order to assess the question of the kind of do the accuracy first thing with inquiry. I try to concede as much as possible to the accuracy firster in my setup. I don't want to be committed to these being the best ways of going, but I'm just going to make them sort of for the sake of argument. Because I think that if you're an accuracy firster, this is probably what you'd want to do. To the vast majority of accuracy first people think these things. The rational agents epistemic states are probability functions. I found one article that like approaches this from a non-probability thing, and I set that aside for the time being. Second, accuracy is measured by a strictly proper scoring rule. I'll just be talking in terms of Euclidean distance because that's the most intuitive. And I can draw pictures and you can just see the answers to the various questions. But nothing in the argument hinges on this. And I sort of suppress all proofs and do everything in pictures because that, but if you have questions about the proofs, then we can discuss them. Okay, so now here's a decision table, just sort of standard kind of Savage style decision theory. And I'll explain what the little things, the letters and the subscripts and what's nots. So the S's are states of the world, just like in Savage. O are the outcomes. And since we're talking about inquiry here, and I'm assuming this thing from the point of view of the accuracy first people, that the outcomes are probability functions. And again, that probability functions, like in standard decision theory, are defined over the states. So defined over S. And then the next thing that you have in a decision theory are your set of actions. And those are the I guys. And so I is in standard decision theory is a function. It's a function that takes you from a state of the world to an outcome. So you could think about that as sort of like perform an experiment. There are different possible results of the experiment depending on the world. So that would be S1 or S2. And so, for example, if you perform experiment I sub 1, if you're in world 1, if it's acidic, then the litmus paper turns one color, that's O1. If it's not acidic, it turns the other color. I always forget which one is which. Doesn't really matter, but you can see how that sort of would work. P is the agent's subjective credence function. So I'll just be using that as a sort of name for one of the whichever credence function the agent starts with. So it's again a probability function defined over S. And there will always be this null inquiry, which just doesn't do anything. You start with your initial probability function. No matter what world you go to, you end up with the one that you started with. So that's this I sub null. And that's going to be an important guy to always have. So I think that, and it seems plausible that you could always just not inquire and just, go to sleep. And so that's what that I null kind of represents, is the choice not to inquire. Okay, what else do we need if we're doing decision theory? We need a utility function. This is an epistemic utility function. I'll just suppress the word epistemic because I'm just assuming that it's built into the whole thing. So that's a function from the outcomes to the real numbers. Okay, and so for example, then you just do your normal expected utility thing. So the expected utility of I sub 1 will be the probability of S sub 1, the utility of O1 plus blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's just an example to kind of work out what the various ideas are. And remember that O are these outcomes are going to be probability functions. That will be crucial in what comes in the next slide. Okay, so this is the agent's utility function again. The accuracy firster should understand this in terms of accuracy, right? Because that's the whole point of accuracy, the accuracy first program. In particular, they should understand it in terms of the distance from their current state, epistemic state, using some strictly proper storing rule. So formally, it would be U of, say, O1 would be the distance, the negative distance, because you want to maximize it, you don't want to minimize it. The distance from O1 to P, where D is, for example, Euclidean distance. And why should we use P as opposed to some like the true state of the world? Well, because this is subjective, right? The whole point of this is that it's decision theory. Decision theory doesn't take in account of what the actual best outcome is, but what the agent's expected best outcome is. And since the probability function on the accuracy first approach is the agent's best estimate of what the, like sort of their best estimate of where the actual world is, that should be the place where you measure from. Okay, so we can talk more about that. This is a very important assumption that I'm making. I have reasons for it, and I hope I just articulated the main gist of why. But if this is not clear to you, then please feel free to ask me during the Q&A, and I try to make it clearer. So you always are measuring from the place that you are. That's to me, the intuitive idea. Okay. So here's a picture. You can represent probability functions in terms of what's called a convex hull. So it's basically just a triangle where you imagine sort of S1, S2, and S3 as each kind of lying on a Euclidean plane, sorry, being a Euclidean plane that sort of cuts this way. So each one is sort of the extreme in one dimension. That is not very well explained. But basically, you can just imagine it as Euclidean plane kind of tilted onto a three-dimensional Euclidean graph thing. And so, like, for example, S1 might be the coordinate 1, 0, 0. You give all of your weight to dimension 1. S2 would be 0, 1, 0, etc. And then the middle of it would be something like 3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Okay, so here's where we are. This is P. Here are various outcomes from our possible inquiries. So on this picture, you can easily see that O1 and O2 have a higher utility than O3 and O4. Why is that? Because they're closer to P, and utility is accuracy, and accuracy is minimizing the distance. So if we go back to these inquiries before, then the first inquiry would dominate the second inquiry. It doesn't even matter what the probability functions are. They're so much closer, they would dominate the other options. But we can also see in this, the sort of main theorem that I prove, which is that the trivial inquiry, the I null, the one that always takes you back to P, always dominates all other ones. Why is that? Well, because the distance between P and P is 0. So it's always the most accurate. And thus, it doesn't even matter what the probability functions are. It will dominate every inquiry. And it also doesn't matter what kind of scoring rule you use, whether it's Euclidean or not. Every strictly proper scoring rule has this consequence. So that's the sort of main negative theorem. And you can just see that in the picture, I think. P is the closest thing to P. That is really thing. So on the accuracy first approach, at least on this very straightforward way of formalizing it, the agent has no reason to genuinely inquire. They should always just do I null. That's the thing that maximizes expected accuracy. Okay. So now we have a new hope, and it's in the form of Charles Peirce. So he says the sole object of inquiry is the settlement of opinion. This is a rather extreme idea as it stands. So the idea that it's the sole thing, that's what his, that's his pragmatist kind of thing. But let's just take a slightly weaker thing. It's plausible that one aspect of the epistemic value of inquiry is the settlement of opinion. So the point being that opinionation is something that we seek in our inquiries. It's one thing. Maybe if Peirce is right, it's everything. But let's just take the idea that it's one of the things in addition to accuracy. So we need a measure of opinionation if we're going to add that. Okay, so now we go back to our decision table and our picture. I changed the picture a little bit. Here's P, O1 and O2 are all the same, but here I put O3 and O4 all the way at the ends, right? And it seems to be intuitive that O3 and O4 are now very opinionated, much more opinionated than P or O1 or O2. And so that leads me to the following idea, which is just to think about the measure from the center of the convex hull. So if we have a finite state space, it's very easy. We just assume that for the time being. But the center of the convex hull, right, this coordinate that's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, that's going to be the least opinionated. And then O3 and O4 are the most opinionated. That's if you go all the way to the end, then you have a view about exactly what the world should be like. So that's I'm just going to use Euclidean distance from that as my example because it's easy to visualize. So on that picture, right, it might be the case that O3 and O4, the inquiry 2 maximizes expected epistemic utility because you would get so much certainty, so much opinionation out of your inquiry, which you wouldn't get in the null inquiry or the I1. But if you move your subjective probability function to an extreme, then it will be the case, once again, that there will be no non-trivial inquiry that you want to engage in. Why is that? Well, because then you sort of are as opinionated as you can get, and you, by your own light, maximize expected accuracy. So if if those are the only two ingredients to epistemic utility, then once again, you're going to have this no genuine inquiry is possible. Okay, so let's look at your accuracy first definition of utility. This is just the repeat of the previous slide. Second pass is you have this accuracy first part, and then you have this alpha times distance between O1 and C, where C is the probability function that assigns equal weights to all states. So that's the center of the convex hull. And then alpha is just a coefficient that determines how much you weight it, right? So you might weight opinionation quite a lot compared to accuracy, or you might weight it very little. So you might want to change that, and I'm not sure that there's going to be a straightforward story. I'm also assuming here that the distance measure between the two will be the same. You could also change that. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of the arguments that I'm making here. But it seems to me plausible that if you wanted Euclidean distance for one, or the Breyer's score or whatever for one, then you would also want it for the other. But that's just not an important assumption for the argument that I'm making. So the results of this way of going is that some inquiries do have epistemic value, right? When the value of the opinionation that could result outweighs the loss in accuracy. But also for a maximally opinionated agent, no non-trivial inquiry has epistemic value, but I think that might be intuitive if you think about, for example, like Kripke's dogmatism puzzle or various puzzles that people have about probability 1. It seems like not crazy to think that those people are sort of prevented from, they're sort of so certain that nothing can kind of jostle them out of their current epistemic state. So I'm not sure that that's an objection, but it is a consequence of the view that I have articulated here. Conclusion, and okay, I'm doing okay on time. I've argued that the accuracy first program fails to explain the epistemic value of inquiry. Then I've shown that by adding opinionation into the mix, we can explain it. obviously you can't explain opinionation in terms of accuracy maximization for the exact reason that you can't explain inquiry in terms of accuracy maximization. I think that's kind of trivial, but maybe worth saying. So it would have to be a new kind of self-standing value. But I haven't defended this value in its own right. I just appealed to authority of a great American philosopher. Future directions axiomatize the decision theory for inquiry and prove a representation theorem so that we know what we're talking about. I sort of have instrumentalist leanings. And so I feel a little bit out at sea when you do something without saying how you're going to measure it, or how this kind of relates directly to actions. But I think that it can be done, and so it seems like a kind of, I don't feel so bad about it. Then the other thing is to investigate the consequences of opinionation and other epistemic values more thoroughly, or kind of values of inquiry, epistemic values more thoroughly in this sort of new framework, which I've sort of given you a taste of what it can do and some of the kind of interesting properties. But I think that there's probably a lot of other values and things that can be defined and have not been explored because it's just been like me and a whiteboard thus far. So if you have suggestions about that, I would obviously very much appreciate it. Okay, and then this, the bullseye thing put me in mind of Looney Tunes. That's all, thanks.